It's a great opportunity to reflect together with other people who are grappling with this question of, what does it mean to decolonize? It's a term that we see everywhere. People drop it into proposals, into research projects, into program designs, onto their websites as part of describing their approach. But sometimes the word is kind of used everywhere without real clarity on what it means in practice and on what it actually looks like on the day-to-day basis and what are some of the key things we should be thinking about. And so this course is really designed to looking at kind of the whole project cycle from the design phase right until you're collecting your data, analyzing it, sharing it. What are the critical things that we should be thinking about when it comes to our M&E and our research? We can go to the next slide, Lucy. So what we try and do over the 4 days of this course is really unpacking the practicalities. I think it's easy to get caught up in debating terminology. What does this term mean? What's the difference between decolonizing and decoloniality and colonialism and coloniality? And there are readings and guidance on those kinds of things, but we don't get into kind of just semantics, but we're interested in, well, what does this mean for me as a practitioner? What does this mean for me as a researcher? How do I actually make this come to life in my work? And how do I make this meaningful and to actually change some of the things that I do on a day-to-day basis? And so we look at a range of issues across the 4 days. We think about what kind of tools and methods are helpful in helping us decolonize. And we also draw on what others have done and others have tried and look at some case studies of how we can learn from those who have tried to do this. The first day of the course is really about trying to understand, well, we talk about colonialism, but what are we actually talking about? What are the things that we might call colonial behaviors? And how does it relate to our work in the development, in the humanitarian space, in research, in monitoring and evaluation? What are some ways in which we might see colonial practices or behaviors seeping through? And then what do feminist principles offer? I think feminist principles are really unique because they're so centered on looking at patriarchy as a power structure and also taking an intersectional approach, which Lucy's already mentioned. But what does it mean for us when we apply these feminist principles to our day-to-day work on M&E and research? And how are these principles relevant? How do they help us rethink the way we do kind of research as usual or M&E as usual? So the first day is a lot of setting up. What is it exactly we're trying to do when we think about colonialism? And the second day onwards is really going beyond just the conceptual, but what are the practical things we can do, the practical strategies we can incorporate into our work to shift the way we normally do research in M&E. And we look at some really practical principles and strategies. We look at, and here it's really based on my own journey of trying to decolonize, reflecting on my own role as previously the person who would kind of sail in as the outside expert to come and fix or come and train or come and do something in a setting that I was not familiar with. And the kind of discomfort that you go through when you think about decolonizing to think, well, is this really my space? Should I really be here? And so it's really bringing together some of my own lessons, my own reflections, and then a lot of the reading and work I've done over the last 10 years to think about, well, how do I reconfigure my work? How do I actually think about power in a critical way and not just in a token way? And so on the second day, we look at some of these principles, we look at existing research, existing practice, and every day you'll see from day 2 onwards, we have a chance to have really nice group work. And it's an opportunity to look at other research projects, to look at other reports that have been written up, and to not just sort of have absorbed all this information over the day, but really now what do I do with this information? How do I apply it? So on the first day, we analyze in small groups, different reports, looking at the methods section, looking at questionnaires and interview guides, and really trying to apply that decolonial lens, that decolonial feminist lens to think about, well, is this decolonial? Is there something colonial about the way this question has been asked or the way that this research is designed? What would I do differently? On the third day, we look at what people might sometimes call decolonial research methods, methods that people automatically assume with being more decolonial, maybe because they're participatory or they seem inclusive or they seem to think about power or center power. And we ask ourselves these questions, are these really decolonial? What makes a method decolonial? And we look at Indigenous methods, including story circles. We look at some participatory action research methods like photo voice. We look at methods like most significant change, and a range of other methods that are being used in work today to measure change. And we have a chance to kind of think about critically, what is it about this method that makes it decolonial or not? And then on the final day, we really look at the analysis and data sharing phase. And this is maybe the most neglected part of the research process when people think about decolonizing, because it's all so focused on wrapping up and getting the findings out there. And we can miss really real opportunities to think about, well, how is the language I'm using, the visuals I'm using, how might this be kind of feeding into colonial narratives? Are there ways that I can shift the way I'm writing or the way I'm curating this data? And again, there's group work on this day to analyze a full report and to really practically apply all the skills across the 4 days into this final activity. And here we see that the group work is a really great opportunity to learn from each other, to see how other people interpret things, to have different perspectives and learnings and our own experiences also brought into the discussion. This is I think will be my 8th time running this course from the Sinara gender training platform and now with Fabulous Feminists. And so I'm really excited to be able to create some space for us to reflect together as a group. Okay, so that's a little bit of an overview of what the course is like. And if we can move to the next slide, just to give you a little sense of some of the things that we talk about. So one of the things we do on the very first day is really establish, well, what do we mean when we talk about being colonial? And we try and focus here on colonial behaviors. And sometimes it's helpful not to just think about colonialism as this sort of vague entity, but breaking it down into some behaviors that we might say were part of the colonial enterprise and maybe have seeped into a little bit of our work on research and monitoring and evaluation. And so a list here of a few, and you can read about some of these in the Peace Direct report called Time to Decolonize Aid, which is on the slides. But we really draw on what decolonial scholars and activists suggest, which is that before you decolonize, you first need to identify what is it that is colonial about this thing that I'm trying to decolonize. What are the colonial threads or the legacies from colonialism that I can see seeping through my work? And so here are a few ideas, and you might be able to think of more as well. So being top down in decision making is often a really key one. Colonial powers, they came into territories that had people living in them, and they made decisions for populations, not with them, and really engaged in very hierarchical decision making about what they felt was right for those people. They didn't value community knowledge or expertise, but were very much focused on enforcing what their knowledge was and what their expertise was. And their knowledge was what was sort of presented as the ideal and what counts. They assumed what issues were important to people, and they used a Western worldview as the standard or norm. This is what counts as being modern. This is what counts as correct behavior. And we talk about in the course the kind of expectations for behavior that colonial powers enforced on people, and how this sometimes seeps into some of the work we might do in the development or humanitarian space, including work on trying to shift social norms or attitudes or behaviors, and the kind of messaging that sometimes accompanies it, that this is the right way and the way that people do things is wrong. So we grapple a little bit with what that means and the kind of colonial legacy of that. Then another colonial behavior would be the way that people or communities, indigenous populations are presented as other, as being so different or strange or unusual, as people to be kind of observed or watched, or just in the way that colonial anthropologists went out and they kind of observed the population and took notes on their mysterious behaviors. Sometimes the ways in which we talk about people's lives, the way we present the issues that they face or their practices can also reinforce some of this messaging. And then lastly, what I like to call a righteous tone, which is that the fact that colonial powers came in with this idea and this intention that they were doing good. They thought, oh, these indigenous populations, they don't know how to look after the land, or they don't have a system for law and order that is like ours. And so we need to fix that. We need to help them. And this kind of saviorist helping, kind of assistance ideas that can seep into work, all under the banner of trying to do something good, trying to correct something, trying to have this kind of we must right this wrong kind of attitude. And this can also, as some of you might be reflecting on, it can seep into some of our work as well. A couple of examples before we have a little kind of exercise to think about individually. So moving on to the next slide. And here I've used a visual on the next slide from the Bukavu series, which is a visual from the Congo, which was done to describe the invisibility of researchers who are based in the so-called Global South. And you can see in this visual, someone has done and basically led this whole research project, design, data collection, analysis. He's added his title, his name, and then is being kind of told, well, no, this is not your work. Your name, your title, like that is not your remit. And it's really reflective here of the kind of dynamics that we often encounter in work on research and monitoring and evaluation about whose work is valued and who does the work. Those who collect the data are often seen as having narrow expertise. Oh, they know the context, they can contribute that, but we did the analysis, or we're the authors, or we're the ones leading it, or we're the ones pulling the strings from a distance. And there are real issues around authorship, around salary disparities that we might see within the research space, the kind of inconsistencies in how people are treated. So a practical example here with a visual to get us thinking about it. And then before we go to do a little Mentimeter exercise, I thought I'd also share this example about what it looks like maybe when colonial messages intersect with gender as a power hierarchy. So Fabulous Feminists, we're a feminist organization. We're always thinking about patriarchy. We're always thinking about intersectionality. And we know that gender as a power hierarchy, it can intersect with other hierarchies, including colonialism. And so here is an example from a series of different reports and websites about how colonialism and also gender might intersect. And here the messaging is very strong. So if you invest in a girl, things can happen. You empower a girl, she can change the world. You invest in a girl, and there are ripple effects. Girls have power, girls have potential. They lift themselves and their communities out of poverty. And so this kind of messaging is often part of a lot of work that we do, and it can feed into our research and our M&E practices. And it can sometimes reduce people's culture or lack of knowledge as something to be solved. How is it solved? It's solved by sending girls to school, and then that knowledge will become the answer. And this kind of sometimes quite simplistic message can really shape the way that we measure change and the way we think about people's lives. And it can also overlook the structural factors that constrain people's lives. It might result in us placing so much burden on of development, of success, of being free from poverty on girls themselves to lift themselves and everyone else out. And it's also reinforcing a kind of message about what counts as modern. Modernity equals going to school or having knowledge or turning away from cultural practices or being economically sufficient. And so these kinds of messages often have their roots in the colonial legacy of what counts as being modern and what counts as success. And that can also seep into our work. Okay, so a few examples there to get us thinking, but now what I'd like us to do is a short little exercise on our own personal experiences or observations of colonial behaviors in development or humanitarian research. And here when we talk about research, it could be assessments, it could be evaluations, any kind of data collection really, or monitoring and evaluation. So if you go to menti.com and type in this code, or you can also use your phones if you have them to scan this QR code. And let's take a couple of minutes maybe, and you'll be able to, in this Menti, write a sentence about examples where you, like the ones I've shared, where you've seen or observed colonial behaviors or colonial dynamics within research and M&E. Let's take a minute to do that. And then I'll share my screen and we can look at some of those examples. So where you have personally experienced or observed colonial behaviors. Great. I can see a couple of examples coming through. So if you can share those specific examples, that would be great. Maybe another minute and then we'll come back together. Let me now share my screen to the Mentimeter as I know I can still see people typing, but please feel free to continue. And let's look at a few of these examples together. Okay, hopefully you can see that now. So a few examples here. So ignoring internal community dynamics, taking for granted that there are good people and bad people. People from outside of Africa think that they only know Western person as a lead in a research, even for country-specific teams. Only the donors are the ones who understand what is needed in a community following a disaster. The community's needs and interests are ignored. And we hear that a lot in a project we're doing at the moment on decolonizing the violence against women and girls field. There was so much discussion about the role of donors, of funders in setting the agenda. And you're kind of required to stick within that. And that can also be a function of that colonial dynamic. Not considering policies built in third world countries despite their positive outcomes, seeing them as intrinsically underdeveloped. Community infrastructure projects, the design, materials, planning are determined by the program with no input from communities. Salary differences, consultants are paid huge amounts. We see that a lot, this huge pay disparities between international and local staff. Preference of international expertise instead of local. Indicators from manuals and handbooks are being used, not what communities want. And we see that a lot, this kind of idea that, well, these are the indicators for the program. This is how we measure change. And people don't really have or kind of prefer to engage the communities or to draw on their experience. And I can see in the chat as well, this idea of racism as well coming in, which is really critical to the idea of colonialism and was so part of how colonial powers set up their power by embedding it within racism as well. And so in this course, we talk a lot about racism and also how it plays out in the day-to-day of working in a humanitarian or development organization as well. A lot of international organizations were set up post World War II, many have not changed. Country directors are always expats, differences in salaries, disregarding local narratives, imposing solutions that don't apply. Writing down is in English, yes, and this could be a huge barrier. And also, I think when it comes to, when you're submitting a proposal or trying to get money for a grant or a design, the requirement is that it be in English, and that can be a real barrier. It means that the usual suspects are the ones who always get the funds and the projects, and the others are kind of disregarded because they maybe don't have that as their first language. Locals are not given the opportunity to validate the research findings. So we rarely go back to the populations from whom we've collected all this data and been so extractive in how we engage with them. We kind of, that's it. Then we come back again a year later, or someone else does and does the same study, and there's this lack of kind of validation and feedback. I've observed how research often prioritizes Western methodologies and perspectives and overlooks local knowledge and voices. Absolutely. So this kind of fixation that what is Western counts as kind of the correct or the only answer. Okay, so a little taste there of some of the things that we cover in the Decolonizing Monitoring and Evaluation and Research workshop. But I guess the key takeaway that I hope you will all carry with you as I pass back to Lucy is the idea that we don't just want to kind of debate terminology or concepts, but really, what does this mean practically? What are some practical tools that I can use? What are some practical questions I can ask with my team? What are some practical things I can include as part of the research data collection team training? What are some exercises we can do together to reflect on power and privilege, to be more aware of our own positionality? And how do we embed these practical feminist ways of knowing and learning into our work? And so we really want it to be practical, not just debating issues or topics, but what are some things I can change? What are some practical takeaways for me? And definitely the people who've attended the course so far, we have a little WhatsApp group where we kind of share and meet every couple of months to continue that learning journey. But it's been what is really helpful for them, I think, is being able to share and learn from each other about what are those practical entry points, what are those practical opportunities, so that decolonizing doesn't seem like it's this huge, overwhelming thing that I have to change everything at once, otherwise I haven't done it. But really, what does it look like to make incremental changes? We all have areas of influence within our organizations. We might not be able to change everything or everything at once in the speed that we would like it, but there's always something we can do to make it better, to make each project better than the previous one. And so we work together on what that looks like. Back over to you, Lucy. Thanks so much. It's 3 hours long.